Welcome everyone. My name's Tony Gilland. I'm Chief of Staff at MCC Brussels, a think tank based in Brussels, obviously. Do check us out. We've got some great stuff on YouTube and on social media. The title for this session is Defending the West in a Dangerous World. I don't think it has a need for a great deal of introduction. It's obviously a more dangerous world that we're living in. And the question of whether the West is ready to defend itself is often brought into stark relief. I mean, here in the UK, we have two shiny new aircraft carriers that are not able to be used very often, either because the propellers broke or because we don't have sufficient support vehicles. And indeed, when we do, we don't have enough sailors. So it's very clear in the UK, at least, there are some significant issues. But let's hear from the panel about their take on this question. Essentially, is the West ready to defend itself in this dangerous world? Very pleased to have on the panel first to speak Tim Black, Dr. Tim Black on my immediate right. He's columnist and books essay editor at Spiked. He also writes for EU Observer, Australian, The Independent and La Repubblica, and he has a PhD in English. Next to Tim on his right is Sir Simon Mayall. Simon, delighted to have you with us. Simon is a consultant and writer and former Assistant Chief of the Army. So he knows what he's talking about on this topic. He's author of a book that he's just rushed here from being interviewed about on the Portillo show on GB News, a book which I urge you to check out on Amazon and help it rise further up the league, is The House of War, The Struggle Between Christendom and the Caliphate. So welcome to Simon. Simon. And then next to go will be Tim Scott on my very far left, which he says is completely inappropriate for him, but you can be the judge of that. Tim is the Executive Director of the Freedom Association. He's a former army captain who served both in our armed services and also with UN peacekeeping forces. And finally, no stranger to many of you, I should imagine, is Sherelle Jacobs, who's a Daily Telegraph columnist and commissioning editor on the comment desk. And in addition to Brexit and Westminster, she writes about geopolitics, helpfully for this session, technology, futurism, and bureaucracy. So please, can we welcome our panel? Okay, they've got 6 minutes each, give or take 30 seconds, and they'll get a yellow warning card when they have 1 minute to go. Tim.
Thank you, Tony. 6 minutes then. Okay, quickly, 1 minute. I'm going to start by briefly reflecting on that post-Cold War moment when the US was, I think, for perhaps nearly a couple of decades, the dominant world power. I'm talking about the so-called that moment when the US and its Western allies, usually under the auspices of NATO or the blue hats of UN, staged grandstanding interventions in the former Yugoslavia and then the Middle East and so on, and of course in Afghanistan. Now, because I think what was striking about that post-Cold War moment was just how disoriented I think Western elites were by the sudden collapse of the USSR. The disappearance, I think, of communism had deprived Western elites of a sense of who they were. And so they began using foreign policy making almost as a means to sort of find a purpose, to demonstrate a purpose, to try to solve that kind of Western identity crisis, to demonstrate a sense of moral purpose to a domestic audience. They were saying effectively, look at us bringing democracy, say, to Iraq, look at us protecting the Libyan people from a terrible dictator. This is what we as the West stand for, and this is what we are against. Now, not only did this kind of geopolitical posturing, and I think it was probably more posturing than anything else, given the kind of lack of strategic thinking behind it, not only did this sort of fail to provide Western elites with the identity and purpose they craved, it also destabilized various parts of the world and sowed the seeds of conflict, I think, which were to erupt as the West's economic and military strength started to decline and the unipolar world started to give way to our current sort of more multipolar world, a world, that is, in which Russia, China and others are seeking to establish a new balance of power. Now, this is where we are at now, in the throes of a shifting world order, a shifting balance of power. And it will, I think, almost undoubtedly cause conflict. It already is, largely because the would-be emergent powers are pushing up against and challenging that post-Cold War world order. We've seen this already in Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which pushes back against the western borders of NATO and the EU. And we're seeing conflict hotting up with China, of course, not just over Taiwan, but over atolls and shoals in the South China Sea. And of course, there's the conflagration slowly enveloping the Middle East. Now, this growing geopolitical disorder has certainly left Western nations painfully exposed militarily. European nations are lacking the military capacity, I think, not only to support Ukraine at the moment, but also for their own self-defense. Just take one example, the British Army. It's now down to 70,000 troops, which is reportedly the smallest it's been since the Napoleonic era. But I think what we're seeing is more than a problem of military logistics and low levels of defence spending. It is a symptom, I'm sure other people on the panel will reiterate, it's a symptom of a much deeper problem. In some ways, the same problem, I think, that underpinned the humanitarian militarism of that older unipolar moment during the 1990s. And that's the problem, namely that Western elites have no real sense of what it is that they should stand for. If anything, I think it's even more pronounced now. This identity crisis is even more pronounced even more pronounced than it used to be. I think today's elites don't value the accomplishments of Western modernity, of liberty, democracy, or indeed perhaps even the nation state itself. And as a result, they have no real sense of what it is, I think, that's worth defending. No sense of what it is that is worth fighting for. In fact, it's probably even worse than that. I think too many amongst our sort of ruling elites, they seem to actively loathe the things that are worth fighting for. A very small sort of case in point is a leaked internal document from the British Army in 2019, which I was just reading about last week. In this document, higher-ups were told to regard soldiers describing themselves as patriots or talking of national identity. They were told to regard these people as potential extremists. That's right, British officialdom was seeking to purge the British Army of the very people that think their country is worth fighting for, which I think sounds more than a little counterproductive. And there are countless other examples, true of the West's, for want of a better word, West's woke military complex, from Joe Biden telling his diplomatic corps to advance LGBTQ rights in 2021, to the UK Ministry of Defence urging staff to display their pronouns in their bios. And I think this loss of a sense of what it is that is worth defending in the West and about the West, the lack of this kind of active turn against what is valued about the West, this rot has spread from the head down. There are now large sections, I think, of Western publics, especially among the younger university-educated cohorts, who believe they know exactly. Thank you, Tony. Know exactly what the West is, and they absolutely hate it. I think from their kind of alternately identitarian and environmentalist perspective, the West is white, oppressive, and the source of the climate catastrophe. Many are more likely, I think, to side geopolitically with the West's foes than with Western nations themselves. I know there are a few readings for this session suggesting ministries of defence need to meet these youngish sort of professional activists in their own terms. I think the idea that you could forge a kind of patriotic militia from Black Lives Matter and Just Stop All activists seems more than a little fanciful. So I think for the West, indeed for Western nation states themselves, the fight to define and defend the West is well and truly on. But this fight is not to be fought and won abroad, as Western elites of the post-Cold War moment mistakenly thought. I think the fight to define and defend the West begins at home.
Thank you very much, Tim. Simon, please.
Thank you. Well, as a soldier, but a historian by academic enthusiasm, I think key things for historians are know your facts, understand context, and be empathetic. And so I'd just like to say, to just kick off with the fact that from 450 AD, when the Roman legions left Britain, we did not build a house for pleasure in this country for 1,000 years. And only after about 1,000 years did the combination of security, stability, prosperity, and technological advance begin the domination of the West. I put the words in inverted commas. None of this is God-given. None of that dominance was God-given. None of it was anyone's by right. It was fought for and defended by generation after generation against ferocious external challenge and significant bloody internal conflicts. The West has been defined by geography, by ethnicity, by history and religion, and I would say from the 16th century, the last 500 years, by the concept of progress. Religion, society, culture, learning, agriculture, industry and technology. And this has led to the westernization of the world. It is difficult to think of a single significant material advance in the modern world that has not come from the West. And additional to that, the West has exported, has globalized all the freedoms that we assume define the West. All those freedoms that we believed we were in the vanguard of, which are now being corroded from within. And it's worth remembering Teddy Roosevelt's great cry, 1910. It's not the critic who counts, or whether doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who's actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes up short again and again, but who does actually strive to do the deeds. He at least fails while daring greatly, so his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who never know victory nor defeat. Now, civilizations, societies and empires are also in the arena, and their survival depends on statesman-like leadership, the prudent use of resources, the willingness of citizens to make sacrifices, and the preparedness of a military to fight and die for an idea and a cause. Those in the arena, including our ancestors, have the right to be judged in the context of their times and by the values and standards of their age, what Chesterton called the democracy of the dead. And the critics of the West, or the British Empire, dare I say, which seems fashionable at the moment, need to be confronted and challenged with the question, compared to what? Frankly, compared to what? None of us stand alone in a vacuum as a civilization or an individual. The collapse of the Soviet Union led to Francis Fukuyama's book, The End of History, rather naively, and also Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilization. And he identified that the West may have had a temporary dominance, but unless you're prepared to defend it, predators are all around you. However, to acknowledge Huntington's thesis meant that the West was going to have to spend money on expensive defense capabilities, and possibly even having to expend intellectual firepower in defending the West. And the championing of the West, with all its flaws, failures, crimes, foul-ups, and admit that it had been the greatest vehicle of human freedom, increased health and wealth creation in human history. However, neither Francis Fukuyama nor Samuel Huntington predicted the scale and pace of the eternal corrosion of the ideal of the West by those who had been the beneficiary of Western dominance, but were devoid of the understanding of history and context, obsessed with its flaws and failures, but susceptible to manipulation. Through a combination of complacency, intellectual indolence, a self-deprecation bordering on self-loathing, lack of convincing leadership, lack of professional competence, we now lack, to take Tim's words, a compelling narrative that confidently sets out the extraordinary achievements of the West, while also acknowledging the immediacy and lethality of the range of threats and challenges we face. We have not only failed to invest in our armed forces, but we have progressively denigrated the values, standards, and motivations of those we rely upon to protect us. We would all deprecate that expression, toxic masculinity. But for many people, that phrase is shorthand for all masculinity is toxic. Take that attitude to the Ukrainian front line and see how far it gets you. Let's recall Orwell's admonition. People sleep peacefully in their beds at night only because rough men stand ready to do violence on their behalf. Military spending has been looked on as an unwelcome discretionary expenditure, not what it really is, prudent investment. And Churchill, that cartoon demon of the left, wrote with regard to the military, the army is not like some limited liability company to be restricted, remodeled, liquidated, and refloated from week to week. It is not an inanimate thing, it is a living thing. Sufficiently disturbed, it will wither, dwindle, almost die. When it comes to the last serious condition, it is only revived by lots of time and lots of money. And let us be clear, most European militaries have now reached that point. What we have in the West is precious to us, we who are fortunate enough to live here in this time, and I believe its achievements and its potential achievements are vital to the well-being of all humanity. Flawed the West may be, but compared to what? The Mughals, the Mongols, the Safavids, the Ottomans, the Chinese empires, Soviet Union, Communist Russia, Islamist death cults? The human condition is sadly one of equality, inequality, suffering, and disadvantage, but the dominance of the West in the last 500 years has done more to create the conditions, legal, ethical, and technological, to address these shortfalls than any previous dominant culture or any likely alternative. Very lastly, let us remember that man, society, civilization, we are in the arena. The West is now very firmly in the arena. We have quite enough on our hands fighting enemies and opponents, set on our physical downfall and destruction, and all the ideas of freedom and progress that define the West, without the insidious and corrosive influence of Roosevelt's timid and cold souls. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks so much, Simon. I didn't dare to interrupt you. You're on a... Okay. Tim, please.
Thank you, Tony. And thank you very much for coming, folks. I think half the battle at this is to decide which meeting you want to go to. I should also try to remember that we're to speak for 6 to 7 minutes, not 67 minutes. So this is a great topic, and I think it's good to see the battle discussing this. Now, if we are to talk about defending the West in a dangerous world, which we need to, we might start with an uncomfortable look at some of the ways that the West might have, in a well-meaning but misguided way, contributed to that stability. NATO has kept the peace well in Europe, but I think some ill-advised and over interventions elsewhere have not always helped. And despite the bravery and professionalism of our forces, I think the ill-fated invasion of Iraq in 2003 and in Libya helped reduce both countries to chaos. On the other hand, there have been many justified and successful deployments and interventions. And as an example, I would cite the Kosovo intervention of 1999, Tony Blair's finest hour, in my view, when the West came to the aid of a mostly Muslim population, even if we did manage to inadvertently bomb the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. Now, despite all this, the West, the world, does face potential and substantial threats. As Simon has already said, I haven't been reading his mail, the so-called peace dividend of the 90s and the so-called end of history, where democracy and was supposed to have universally triumphed, now look a bit naive, if well-meaning at the time. So conflicts continue in Afghanistan after the troublesome Western withdrawal there, Ukraine, where Britain has played a leading role, attempts made to delegitimize and attack Israel. China threatens Taiwan and builds bases on unclaimed islands in territorial waters. We also continue to see so-called grey zone conflicts short of all-out full-scale war. These range from cyber attacks to targeted assassinations. But we should also look closer to home at the UK forces and at our own security. Whilst we've clearly not been a global power, a major power for many decades, if you were to draw a four-circle Venn diagram of NATO, permanent members of the UN Security Council, Europe and the Commonwealth, then I think I'm right in saying that Britain is the only country that's in all four. So we're very much at the crossroads of the world, and we have a role to play, and we should be a positive force in the world. So as an example, the AUKUS, that's Australia, UK, USA, defence and submarine deal, I thought was a very good example of this. And I well remember Boris's comments about the raucous squawkus of the anti-AUKUS caucus. Only Boris could have come up with that one. That deal will see the three countries cooperate to provide Australia with 5 nuclear-powered, note, not nuclear-armed submarines, and a rotation, hopefully, a rotation of a British or a US submarine based in Australia. Also, Japan, a friendly democracy that we would do well to keep in with, is said to be interested in joining the deal. Japan and Italy are partners with the UK on the next generation Tempest fighter plane, though we hear that inevitably there have been funding pressures. The aircraft carriers will be going out next year, or at least one of them will be, on a global deployment, although it will take most of our available ships, and we could do with some here. The Navy is down to just 9 frigates and 6 destroyers, and we're struggling for a supply ship. Nevertheless, these deployments and exercises, I think, send the right message. Don't misunderestimate us. And I was talking to Simon beforehand, and we both feel the army should be about 100,000, not 70,000. Talking of acronyms and alphabet soup, I'm a big fan of CANZUK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, UK. These 4 countries have much in common, and enhanced relationships between them would really help boost Western security. Giving away the strategically important Chagos Islands, I think, has been a poor move. At least Starmer has reassured us at PMQs that the Falklands and Gibraltar are safe. Bookmark that one. We can only hope so for our bases on Cyprus and other territories. Armed forces recruitment under pressure, and not just here. Boots on the ground matter, and whilst high-tech kit is great, it can only do so much. Colonel Tim Collins has written of what he sees as too much of an overzealous pursuit of diversity in the armed forces at the expense of our forces' traditional recruiting base. It's not just about more kit. The overall offer needs to be improved, including stuff as basic as service housing. The West needs to wake up, rearm and rediscover ourselves. Diplomacy and use of soft power can only do so much, and a weak West is asking for trouble. We found out this week that North Korean troops may be heading for Ukraine. How many more clues do we want? Defence spending of 2.5% of GDP needs to be the floor, not the ceiling. We currently spend about 2.25%. May we need to go to 3%. Some of the NATO freeloaders, including Germany, are getting the message, but Spain, Italy, and Canada are barely spending 1.5%. So here's my final point. For how much longer can we comfortably rely on our prosperous lifestyles, secured in many ways by the sacrifice of previous generations? How long can we continue to take them for granted if we're not prepared to defend them?
Thank you very much. Thanks, Tim. Finally, Sherelle, please.
I was really pleasantly surprised to be invited to speak on this panel because I don't know anything about tanks, full disclosure. So if there are any sort of military questions, then it will be best directed at other people
Never
qualified.
Trump.
But I know a little bit about geopolitics. I'm not going to actually talk too much about geopolitics in my introduction. I'm going to talk more about the West's existential crisis and how that undermines its geopolitical coherence, commitment and power in a dangerous world, because the battlefield is not just out there, it's actually in here. The elephant in the room is that if the West is going to defend itself and defend so-called liberal principles, then it's going to have to redirect massive public spending away from domestic things towards defence. This is at a time of stagnation, when hip surgeries are being cancelled because of sewage leaks in hospitals, and at a time when it actually takes longer to get from London to Boston, Lincolnshire by train than it takes to fly from London to Boston into USA. So let's be real here about the trade-offs, because this is about tanks versus trains, artillery versus ICU beds. There is a big problem right now, and that is that the West doesn't know what it stands for, and it doesn't know why that is worth defending. Now, during the Cold War, it was clearer what the West stood for and why it was worth defending. It stood for freedom in the face of oppression. It stood for the organicism of self-regulating free markets in the face of the arrogance of central planning. It stood for the romance of the rugged individual versus the divine collective. And this, of course, is a Disney French-ish simplification, and not everyone agreed on the story, to say the least, at the time. But the point is that that didn't really matter. What mattered is that elites believed it, and a decent proportion of the public also believed it. And that helped to justify what were impressive levels of defense spending during the Cold War. And today, I would say that the story of who the West is and why it's worth defending isn't so clear-cut. Somehow the claim that it stands for freedom does have less power. There is a widespread belief in Western civilization now that it was founded on slavery and it was founded on protectionism rather than liberty. There is also a widespread belief that freedom is actually a soiled ideal, that it represents this kind of reckless, selfish egoism that actually poses a threat to civilization. And I think we saw that discourse really emerge and start to crystallize during the pandemic. And other values, such as equality and diversity, actually have more salience. And there isn't the same sense of clarity, I would say, with ideals like equality. There isn't that sense of clarity that these are distinctively Western. So freedom is no longer this kind of uniting principle. And I think that we're losing sight of the fact that freedom is not merely sort of a polemical passion, sort of a fetish on the right, but it's actually a very pragmatic civilizational recipe. It is quite simply the modern West's secret sauce. But in order to make that, once again, a mainstream unifying idea, I think three things need to happen. I'm going to whiz through them because I'm running out of time. But three intellectual tasks. So the first is that freedom lovers need to achieve some collective clarity on where the neoliberal doctrine on freedom went right and where it went wrong. This is partially a task of economics, but in my opinion, this is also a task of putting economics in its place. And it's time to actually challenge the Cold War liberal orthodoxy that economic freedom is the foundation stone of liberty, and replace it with the insight that it's actually freedom of thought and freedom of speech. That is the wellspring from which other freedoms flow. And just the example of the Industrial Revolution, that was preceded by an epoch of a radical new culture of hereticism, of inquiry, exploration, experimentation, and questioning of established ideas. And secondly, I think that we also need a project that is going to salvage some of freedom's historical credibility. Now, what the past few years has taught us is that history is a battlefield in the West. And I think that it's time for an equivalent, a response to the New York Times' 1619 project. The latter, of course, it aims to reframe America's history by placing the consequences of slavery at the very center of the American national and, by extension, liberal international narrative. Now, this needs to be countered by a fresh, nuanced understanding of the West's history, which acknowledges that the West's grand narrative has, for the large part, been a stumbling, schizophrenic groping towards freedom. And actually, if you were going to do a graph of tracking freedom over the last 500 years, you would have impressive peaks and you would have quite mortifying troughs. But the bottom line is that there is this undeniable embracing and diffusion of freedom. And we need to find a way to tell that story again. And thirdly, I think we also need a vision of a liberated future, which we can go out and sell to the next generation. I call them the AI generation, because I think that one of the reasons why people find sort of eco-populism so bewitching is that this vibrant, censorious substitute for futuristic fantasizing that people just aren't connecting with in terms of what is coming out of Silicon Valley. And I think that there needs to be, in particular, a clarity about what kind of AI superpower does the West want to be, and why is it different to the kind of AI superpower that is emerging in China? You know, China, the sort of hyper-safe, hyper-controlled Shangri-La, where you've got cameras that can analyze 100 faces a second, and no criminal can escape, but also no person who disagrees with, the CCP can escape either. And I think one thing that we have to talk about is how AI can actually unleash human creativity and complement human creativity rather than seeing it as an intelligence to replace and survey humankind. And I've got the red card, so I'm going to stop. But I do want to say, I do find myself asking whether, had Putin dared to attempt what he did, would China be planning to be military ready to invade Taiwan by 2027? Did they not smell a kind of ideological decay and a collapsing confidence in the West? That's why I think it's really, really important that we have this urgent kind of mission to try and find this kind of unifying philosophy that we can all actually come together and support, that will give us the strength in order to make the sacrifices that we're going to need to make.
Thank you, Sherelle.